I'm Alejandro, and I'll be your guide today as you view our recorded webinar on sexuality, intimacy, and dementia. Thank you so much for choosing to do this because it's a tough subject, but it needs to be talked about. The idea that people living with dementia have some needs, and it's an uncomfortable conversation. So, of course, Teepa's willing to open that door up, and thank you for stepping through it. So my role here is going to be as a guide through the content, because it's an hour and a half full of lots of information and lots of thoughts to consider and possibly some new ideas. So as you watch, you'll see me pop in and out through some different sections. And this recorded webinar is actually live. So you will also see me in the webinar. Luckily, I wore a hat that day. So there are other folks that are interacting with Teepa who just came because they were interested. So you'll see some other folks popping in and out, and there are also some slight sound issues because when you're doing something live, well, you get what you get in the moment. So as we go through the content, Teepa's going to switch from topic to topic, and that'll be my point to come in and do a little guiding. So I'm going to give you an overview before you get started so that you know where we're going. So our topics, we'll start with Teepa actually exploring the ideas that are similar and different between intimacy and sex. Then Teepa will give us an overview of some cases that she's worked with in the past that may be a possibility for exploring these ideas. And then we'll actually pick one from the webinar, and the group's going to do a deep dive into Sarah's case. And then finally, we'll do a bit of a wrap up. So you'll get to hear where the group ended up with Teepa, but also where you end up. So we'll give that consideration, being that you're a different person than anyone else on this webinar, and you have a different history and a different relationship with dementia. So we'll go ahead and get started, and I'll see you in a little bit.
We're going to talk about sex today. I know that's why you're all here, but we're also going to be talking about intimacy. So we're going to be doing both. And I wanted to throw out some words, and I want us to think about these words. And as you're thinking about the words, I want to have you to think, who in your life is this person? Do you have somebody who meets these needs? And what's your definition of some of these words? And what would happen, then we'll add in, what would happen if you develop dementia? So I'll start off with intimacy. And to talk about intimacy, I want us to think about intimacy in several ways. How about intellectual or cognitive intimacy? Do you have somebody who you would consider your cognitive or intellectual intimate? Someone who you share a lot of thoughts with, somebody who you talk with a lot, somebody who you feel is somebody that gets it. They get how you think. They get what you are wanting and what you value. And when you're trying to express them, you guys speak the same language, or at least they understand your words and your language and your meaning behind your words. You have somebody you're intimate with. Okay. Now, is that different, or is it the same person that you're emotionally intimate with? Or do you have several people that you're intellectually intimate with, but just a few people that you're emotionally intimate? And what does it mean to be emotionally intimate with someone? Is it that you pick up on their needs and emotional wants and likes and such? Or is it that the other person picks up on yours? What is the meaning of intimate, emotionally intimate to you when it comes to other human beings and yourself? What does it mean to be emotionally intimate? How do you get emotionally intimate? How do you demonstrate that I want to become intimate with you, or I am intimate with you? And how would somebody else know that about you? And then if any of you have it, what kind of intimacy do you have in your spirit? Like your practices, your faith beliefs? Who's your intimate for spiritual things? Are you someone who meditates? Are you someone who prays? Do you pray in private, in public? Do you do open prayer, closed prayer, formal prayer? What is the value of being where you're at? What are your rituals and your routines around spiritual intimacy? Who are you intimate with? Is it a being? Is it a person? Is it a place? Is it a sense? And then we can get to the ones that people more think of. Physical intimacy, What does it mean to be physically intimate with? Are there levels of intimacy? Are there certain things you can do in some situations you wouldn't do in others? And who are your physical intimates? And my example would be a football game versus the locker room after the football game versus the hot dog stand at the football game versus people sharing seats in a stadium and people trying to get out of the stadium to get to their cars afterward. All of those can be physically intimate situations, but we may not have what we would call intimacy with all those people, but we can certainly be in intimate situations. And yet we figure out a way to not feel like we're in an intimate moment in a public space. Somehow that works for us. Even though you could be body to body, touching lots of body parts, it still doesn't have the same feeling as being in a bed at night or on a couch with someone in the privacy of your own home, in a relationship that you promised one another you would be the only people. So that idea of physical intimacy, what are some of your intimate moments? What does that feel like? What do you have there? And then to talk about intimates at work, intimates who are your friends, who you consider intimates, having an intimate relationship or seeking an intimate relationship. And we'll stop there for a second because I just want to put all those words out there and see what comes to mind when I say that without dementia. When we talk about all that stuff without dementia. What are you thinking? What kind of reactions do you have to all those words?
Teepa, I actually started making a list of people for each one of those categories. And,
okay. Yeah.
And some were the same and some were different.
So which one of those, Shelley, if I could prod a little more, which one of those kinds of things are some of the more important? Is it physical intimacy, emotional intimacy, spiritual intimacy, intellectual? What do you value the most?
For me, it's intellectual intimacy and spiritual.
Okay.
Top two. And then work, because I work with so many people and I'm with them so much. I think that's an important part to frame for myself.
So it has a little bit of how you spend time every day, that you can be intimate with someone because of the amount of time and the shared task that you're doing or the shared space that you occupy. So they become your intimate, whether you, now do you like everybody you're intimate with?
Everybody I put on the list, yes.
Are there people that are okay, now see, here's the opposite though. Are there people who are on your intimate list, your work intimates, that you don't care for all that much, but because of the nature of your relationship, it's a work relationship, you're intimate with them and you've got to figure out how to build walls and bridges and such.
Yes.
Complicated.
Yeah, I started thinking about that just as when you said that. And yeah, there are people I'm intimate with that I don't necessarily like.
So what would happen if the filter that kept your mouth shut about how you feel got left out, do you think?
Oh, I would let them know right away what I really think about them.
Would you do some different things?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I think I would lose a lot of control.
Would you want to be in the same spaces?
Absolutely not. Not with people I don't like.
Oops. Would you want them to get out or would you want to get out?
I think it would depend on whether I could get out. If I could get out, I would. If I couldn't, I would try to push them away.
Ooh, so now you're becoming physically aggressive, even though they didn't do anything. I mean, this is the same situation we're in every day, and all of a sudden you're getting physically aggressive with people.
Possibly, yeah.
Shelley,
I think they would have to do something.
This is so disappointing. I thought you were going to be one of these really nice people, and I'm really disappointed. So this need that you have a situation on your hands where space is demanding intimacy of you, time is demanding intimacy of you, and you've learned to cope for years. And now all of a sudden, if I take away your impulse control, suddenly situations that you always put up with, you're getting aggressive.
I might, yeah. I'm not sure entirely what I would do, but I think
you think you might be verbally ugly first?
Yes. Yeah. I don't think I would do anything physical.
Do you think people would be surprised about that from you?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
So,
I mean, you were.
and do you think they would be so surprised they might say, Shelley, what are you doing? This isn't you. Why are you talking like this?
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah.
Did you just swear at me?
Yeah, I
Shelley,
did.
did you, Alejandro, did you know this about Shelley? I mean, so, okay, so I'll pause there because when we get surprised by someone in intimate situations and it surprises us, one of the things that humans tend to do is turn to someone else that they have a relationship with to affirm and confirm that I'm right and she is wrong. And so we start picking sides. And it's because what we anticipated isn't what happened. And we're using old relationships to guide present practice. And it's a reactive thing. And so now I've got Alejandro either on my side or on Shelley's side, but we're choosing up sides. So now we're at the football game. And how we're going about intimacy is totally different than how we would have done it before. And again, I haven't even moved to sex. I'm just talking about spending time with one another and having to be in one another's space and how it can engender a sense of intimacy that in my own home with other people not around, I don't have that. And it's tricky because what we may be noticing is a shift in a person's ability to maintain a public face in a intimate situation and to get needs met in a way that they've done it before that they can't do now. And so getting your intimacy needs met and maintaining boundaries for people who like to be in control. Now, anybody else have a different response or reaction to those ideas of intimate relationships, intimacy, that kind of stuff? Carolyn, did you have anything that came up for you or you were thinking about?
Yeah, I think for me, when I just looked at all of whether it's intellectual, emotional, spiritual, physical, what it all boils down to for me is someone that I want to share with and that I feel comfortable sharing with. So whether it's, again, intellectual in nature, spiritual in nature, whatever the case may be, and it might be the same person. For me, there's a few people in there that kind of meet that criteria. And then if I kind of project forward and think, well, geez, what if I didn't have those people, the people around me that I would feel comfortable sharing like that? What would I do, or what might it be like?
Right. What would be an unmet like or an unmet want or an unmet need if what you have isn't what you have anymore?
Right.
So that as things are changing for you, either due to your dementia or due to someone else's dementia, how do you cope with that, and how do you get through that, and how do you see the other person's perspective, or can't you? And when does it not work, and when does it work?
Yeah.
So what do you think would be something that would help you sustain an intellectual or a spiritual or a physical comfort? What could somebody do to help you if they weren't your previous person? What would be some ways in which it would be helpful for that person to give you that sense of share? It's an okay share.
I think it would be, I'd want to feel like they knew me somehow.
Okay.
So they, like, for example, from a spiritual perspective, and if we think just in my mind, I know spirituality and religion are different, right? But for me, I'm Catholic, right? And so it would be nice if somebody knew that and understood kind of the ritual of Catholicism and what it means, and that I could.
Yeah, so the difference between a crucifix and a cross.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
The idea of prayer and kneeling as a way of being,
right.
versus simply sitting and praying.
Yeah, the importance of going to mass every Sunday
Mhm.
and not missing it. You know,
Right, right.
understanding that instead of saying, "Oh, if you miss a week, it's not gonna matter."
Right. And if you found somebody in a long, dark coat with a white turtleneck on, that you might become very, very adamant about going and being with that person, even though that person knows nothing about you because of their appearance as a priest. Or if you had an intimate relationship with a priest at some point that was not a healthy relationship, was not a good memory for you, it may trigger you to do something to that human being, and yet it has nothing to do with the relationship in the moment. It has a lot to do with the relationship of the past. All right, so unless anybody has some other things, what I brought intimacy up first is I think that's the most avoided topic. We don't talk about issues of intimacy. We immediately go to sexuality because it's a much more hot topic and it's a lot more, oh yeah. But I personally believe that a lot of what people identify as sexual behaviors result because of a lack of support for intimate relationships and the need to have the intimate ability to have somebody who gets you and supports you and understands you and gives you the space and the ability. We do things that trigger a sexual result, but what we're really looking at is changes in awareness of intimacy and the ability to behave in ways that I should, given the actual relationships and the situation versus that person might be getting from our behaviors or our words or our actions.
So, what did you figure out? Did you get any sense of who your folks are that you're intimate with in some different ways? Intellectually intimate with, physically intimate with, but starting to separate the ideas of intimacy from sexuality. And maybe there is some crossover with people, or maybe these are unique individuals altogether. One of the things that Teepa mentioned was actually the word filter. And in talking through the ideas or questions with Shelley, actually starting to bring up the idea that when people are living with dementia, this idea of a filter becomes a bit tricky. And some of you may have said that word before, but not really recognize what part of the brain that's coming from. So go ahead and rub right here, because this is the part where your filter actually is. Only we can give it a different name. And some of you might notice yourself doing this when that filter should have kicked in, but didn't quite. So when Teepa brings up a filter, what she's really talking about is this executive control center. This is the front of the brain. And what you're looking at the top here is fully wired in prefrontal cortex versus down at the bottom, someone who was living with dementia as a diagnosis for at least 10 years, specifically Alzheimer's disease. And so you'll notice that the wiring is absolutely gone here. So the idea behind wanting or needing people who you've been intimate with to be around, or missing that, or simply stating to people, I don't want you here, or something further than that, maybe a little harsher language, actually comes from this prefrontal cortex, this executive control center. And there are actually 6 skills here. And the first is impulse control. And the second one is using incoming data to be logical and come to some conclusions. It's also about making choices and starting and sequencing through tasks. Also noticing self-awareness, what I'm good at and what I might need some help with. It's an accurate self-awareness piece when we have this wiring intact. And then the last one is seeing it from other people's points of view. Now, the ideas that Shelley and Teepa talked about were tricky when you don't have the wiring in your prefrontal cortex anymore. The idea that Shelley could or would be mean in the future, although she is not that way, is not because that's just part of the disease. It's actually because there's a missing wiring piece. The things that Shelley could maybe do at this point may not be there in the future. But we also want to start to now look at, what does this idea of sex mean for people living with dementia? And where have we been historically with it? So we're going to have Teepa kick back into the webinar, and now we're going to switch from intimacy into sex and sexuality.
So I'll go back for a second and do a little more sharing here. Let's go to the other side of that slide and let's talk about sexuality, gender, being sexy, sexually aggressive behavior, sexually acting out, sex talk, sexual intercourse, sex partner, and the term masturbation. So let's look at those words. And those are all pretty normally used words around this thing called dementia and sex, for sure. So I'm going to pause there and I'm going to come away from the share. Hopefully you can remember the words enough. How many of you, when you do advanced directives or think about your future care plan for yourself, if you were to develop dementia, have all that written out and you shared it out with a care person so that if you ever got to a place, you will have told somebody what your most private behaviors are around these things? Yeah, well, good luck if you ever get dementia then, because everybody's going to make assumptions that your gender is what they think your gender is, that your behaviors are going to be what they've seen you behave like before, that of course you never oh, you do, oh, what tool do you use, oh my heavens, would you be considered sexually deviant, sexually aggressive? Would you be considered sexually intolerant? This, I think, of all things, is the one subject that is not identified on any care plan much that I've seen until there's an issue. And then all of a sudden, we're going to write it all over the place about what we need to do to manage somebody's sexual behavior. But we don't identify people as sexual beings or gender-specific beings. We just make assumptions about them. So I'm going to go back to the group again and say, what do you guys think about this idea of advanced planning for sexual preferences? And sexual likes and dislikes and sexuality in general?
I think it's a great idea, a really important one.
And yet, what do we think actually happens it's not even listed on care plans, just so you know.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Well, and the
number of buildings I've been in, never seen sexuality sort of listed as a possibility.
Right. And that's where we run into trouble. People, they act out in different ways, and maybe to them it's normal, or maybe not. But then you have families that come in and say, oh, he never did that. Well, they don't know, really, do they?
There you go. Yeah.
They haven't talked it over. I mean, I, as a mom, am not going to talk it over with my kids. I don't know about you. But
here's what you need to know about me.
Right.
Well, and what I was saying in the comments is that sexuality is an intimate conversation. So, like Gay's saying,
yeah,
I tease my kids, but nobody wants to think about your parents having sex. They don't want to have that conversation with you, but at some point, we got to talk about it.
Yeah. I mean, what is important touch for you? Where is it important for you to be touched on a regular basis so you know you're loved? What kind of touch shows love for you? Now, whether that love is simply friendship or whether it's an intimate love, what do you as a human being, what kind of touch do you need from another human being? And what makes you really uncomfortable because of your life experiences? What kind of touch do you not want? By whom? And what does that mean? And I think because we don't have because we never talk about this, it shows up way too often in issues with sexuality and aggressive behaviors, because we trap people into situations where we are doing incredibly intimate things in incredibly intimate spaces. And people are so uncomfortable with what's happening, or they misinterpret what's happening, so that we then like to label people as being, and I'm just going to put it out there, bad. These are bad people. These people should not be allowed in some states, they want them to be quarantine. They want them to have no contact with other people. They actually would like them to be in seclusion. They don't want them to have experiences with other elders. They don't even want them to have experiences with staff other than a very select group. That is some people's reaction to people who are living with dementia, who are demonstrating distress or interest in what's going on, but misunderstanding and misinterpreting behaviors. And that idea of, if I do not get what you're trying to do, I've got to interpret it somehow, because humans don't not take in data. They take it in. It may be damaged data, inaccurate data, but they're going to do something with it. That's just how we're built.
So are you uncomfortable or are you doing okay? The idea of picturing a loved one or thinking about a loved one in this way of being sexual for many of us is a huge, huge challenge. But what Teepa's bringing up is the idea that we're doing advanced planning for lots of people, not just people living with dementia, but are we also considering what changes might happen and what historically has been their sexual nature? We don't often. And it's because this is a hard subject to talk about. But starting to think about for yourself, how might you put your own sexual preferences into something that someone else could read and then help you in your journey if you're one day living with dementia? So those thoughts, when we're considering caring for a loved one, become especially difficult. Sometimes even so challenging that you may want to consider a third party as someone to gather that information and have it. Because separating yourself from certain pieces of this may be a little more comfort, and it may actually help you through the process. So we're now in 2020, and this webinar was recorded far before COVID ever came around. But Teepa brought in the idea that there's also consideration being given for, we want to quarantine people if they are sexually deviant or if they are perceived to have these sexual needs that aren't being met. And those are Pat's words, those are my words. But often what we're hearing is they are being sexually inappropriate and we can't get it to stop. So the idea of quarantining people is further pulling them away from what they may be seeking. And having lived through a pandemic, as we have, the ideas of being quarantined are not sitting well for just being social with people, not even giving consideration to the idea of some of us having some sexual needs in association with that. So having a thought for yourself of, if you had to describe what you like sexually, what you would want, and maybe even just generally where you like to be touched or I don't like to be touched, who would you have that conversation with? And do you know that about the people you're caring for if you are a care partner right now? Because the tricky part can be, once we start down this journey of dementia, if I don't have some of that knowledge and awareness gathered already, it becomes even more tricky for me to gather it as a care partner. So giving consideration to, how do I start to get this for myself? How do I start to plan ahead a little bit for this very tough thing without missing it? Because when we miss pieces, we often are having holes in our care, and that's where trouble starts. So now that we've explored intimacy and sex, hopefully there's a bit of a separation there for you. But what Teepa's going to do now is give us an overview of multiple cases. And so Teepa has a rich experience in lots of different places, but these cases are all pulled from some real life experiences where either she's been in the situation or was called in to consult on a situation. So take a look and see if anything is familiar or if there are things that stand out to you in the descriptions.
So what I think I'll do now is read out a case or two, because I have a few cases that I thought might be of interest. And these are ones that I've actually had personal experience with some situations. I always get the interesting cases, I think they call it. People don't tend to call me in unless something really interesting is going on. So let me go to a few cases and I'm going to have you come back. Okay, so Harry, and I've changed names obviously, but the rest of the content is accurate. Harry Mason is a 63-year-old male. He's got Pick's disease, which is frontal temporal with pieces of both. He has very few words and poor understanding of any verbal content. He's very impulsive, And he tries to touch female caregivers when any ADLs are done. And he puts his hands in his pants, unzips and urinates in hallways and in corners. And he tries to give everybody, females only, very particular, never males, females only, bear hugs from the front. And when he gets you in a bear hug, he rubs his body against the body of the female. And he thrusts a couple times, and then he goes, ah! And then he lets you go. It's pretty intense for people who are not familiar with it. And his wife reports no history of problems, although she is frustrated and embarrassed by his behavior and yells at him whenever she comes to visit, which is rare. So that's one case. And I'm gonna give you about 4 cases, and then we'll go back and we'll talk through sort of some of the stuff I want us to talk about with each of these cases. All right, let me go to my second situation, and we can look at this one. Okay, so Sarah Holt. Do you have it? Is it coming up? Yes, okay. Sarah Holt is 79-year-old widowed retired school teacher. So she had been married. She's mid to late disease. So she's an amber ruby with very limited skills. She approaches other females and asks for a kiss and holds hands with any female, totally ignoring males. She has no immediate family, and she has a niece who is acting as POA. But her niece didn't know her well. She was from out of state, but she came and agreed to be POA for her aunt because there wasn't anybody else. And the girl's mother had died. So there's the girl and her aunt, and she's not close. She's just POA because there had to be somebody. Sarah emerges nude from her room in the middle of the night and early AM and tries to get in other people's beds. Okay, so those are her behaviors and the issues that her situation around, brings up. Don Gallo, he is a 32-year-old married male, but he's status post head injury from Iraq. And he's bed and chair bound, and he's dependent in all care and mobility due to right side paralysis with both a concussive head injury plus shrapnel and a head injury where he lost part of his skull. So he is not an attractive looking person anymore either, though he had been quite a handsome young guy, and he was married before he went over. He makes multiple sexual comments and attempts to touch or grab caregivers, and grab is their name, to grab caregivers throughout care, whether or not family is present. He becomes very agitated during mouth care, peri-care, or finger sticks because he's diabetic and they have to do finger sticks because he's brittle multiple times a day. And they have to get close to him because he's bed and chair bound, and because of his paralysis, he does tend to slide and slip and go down a good bit, so he has to be repositioned frequently. Frank and Myrtle Booth have been married 60 years. Both are in their 80s. Frank has signs of beginning Alzheimer's, and Myrtle is mid to late stage. So she is amber. And Frank wants to continue having sexual relationships with Myrtle 3 to 5 times a week. He likes being sexually active, and he says they were always very active. They loved sex. They had sex a lot. In their kids, their kids didn't know how active they were. Frank says that he and Myrtle used to cook with gas a lot, and he knew how to turn up her flame. So Frank really sees himself as still very sexually alert, aroused, though he's in the early signs of Alzheimer's disease, but that's his self-report. Myrtle actually cries and tries to get away from him when he first approaches her, but gets quiet when they're in their room. And he does initiate sexual activity with her multiple times a week. And then we have 2 more. Fred Harper is 75-year-old and he has Lewy body disease. And he reports that staff are sexually attacking him at night, grabbing his privates when they help him. And he wanders the building at night, trying to enter other people's rooms and calling for his wife, who's been dead for 7 years. And he's a retired Episcopal priest. And Episcopalians can actually get married, just unlike the Catholics. They have different rules. And finally, we have Barbara King, who's only 72. She's divorced. She's been divorced 3 different times. She's a retired lawyer. She has no healthcare power of attorney. She has a history of a very sexually active lifestyle. She got married and divorced multiple times, and by report of her children, 2 daughters, she cheated on her husbands each time, and that's why they divorced. And so she would date a good bit, find a new relationship, think it was going to work out, and then in short order, she would end up not being faithful to that husband and get reconnected with somebody else. So she's very early in her Alzheimer's, and she's very impulsive in speech and actions. And she also uses sexually explicit words and comments to and about other people and about herself, and what she's missing, and how she sure would like a man. She could use one to rub up against her, and you know where she'd like him to put it. And she knows if she could just get out of this joint. She don't know why they locked her up. And she's started looking at the older men and making comments about sugar daddies. If she can't get somebody who's young, she'll take what she can get. And she is relatively young. And she has one daughter who is really wanting to support her, who she is. It's just who she is. And I don't see why we should be trying to stop her. If men don't want to have sex with her, that's fine. Mom gets satisfied. Mom has always been a sexual being. She's always been very open about being a sexual being, and I don't know what I'm supposed to do now. The other daughter has never liked it, always wanted it to stop, and is now feeling this has to stop. She's going to end up being in a psych unit. Okay, do I give you the flavor? Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing, and we're going to go back to any of these cases at all that you would like to lay out, and we can start to explore a little bit about how we could help. My goal is to help people better appreciate what's going on, so we can come up with some options of how better to handle a situation, because what classically is happening isn't good for anybody. So anybody have some thoughts or preferences about which one they'd like to explore first?
Teepa, I just have one question. When you say you want to help people, you're talking about the people that are around them, not necessarily, and indirectly that way helping the person themselves.
It all depends. In some cases, with a young man who's had a head injury, when I worked in head injury units, one of the things we did with some people is help them be able to be more effective sexually. And to learn to use an assistive device if they were not able to have an intimate relationship with another human being at that time and place. Because at age 32 or age 40, males particularly still have a lot of testosterone, and women have a lot of estrogen. And figuring out what to do with that episodic urge that somebody might have, how to have it be reasonably managed is something that, as an occupational therapist, I'm very comfortable sort of bringing up and putting out on the table, because this is the rest of their life. In some cases, I'm actually talking about with the human being that is living maybe with dementia of some sort. But that means I have to find a partner who's willing to share that level of intimacy of education, if nothing else. And probably with dementia, not participating actively in the act, but setting the person up, being able to get the equipment out, being able to do whatever it is the person needs done in preparation for having an intimate event or a sexual event. But that's not everybody's level of comfort, and I appreciate that. It's just, let's at least have a conversation, start a conversation about this stuff with something other than opinions. So anybody have any thoughts about which one, appeals to you as a point of conversation and discussion that we might be able to use as something to help us figure things out?
the one about the retired school teacher, we have to be careful that we don't assume that it's sexual, and that's what can happen many times, is that we project it as sexuality, where maybe she had a tendency to like the younger girls, so she is seeing the care workers as her students, and so it's not a sexual thing at all. When she comes out in the nude, it doesn't mean that that is sexual either. She could have just forgotten to put clothes on. So we have a large tendency not to know their past. So the more we know about their past, the more we can put two and two together and understand what is happening, and not because we think it's sexual, it's not necessarily a sexual act at all.
Right. And just as what we're saying with Shelley, she may be perceived as being aggressive. What's really wrong is she's being forced to be in an intimate situation with people that she didn't like. And so we're seeing a certain outcome, and it's easy to make assumptions rather than do a careful assessment of what's happening.
Mm-hmm.
So since you brought up Sarah, let's go back to Sarah for a second, and let's take the pieces of the puzzle. Let's see if we can figure out some pieces to a puzzle, which unpack the person and who they've been and who they are now, and any other physical or emotional kinds of things or sensory things that might be going on with that human being. And what type and at what place in their dementia are they? What's their awareness, their abilities at that point of the disease? And then who's around them? Who all is around them, and where are they? Are they going to be supportive, or are they going to push buttons? What's happening around them, both helpers, but also other people? And then what about the environment? What in the environment is contributing or supporting or acting against? And what about time? Either passage of time, time of day, time in life, where might the person be thinking they are? So looking at those 6 pieces of the puzzle. So let's go back and take a look at Sarah a little bit more. So just as a quick review on her, let me pop up her data so you have it for a second. And then I'll ask you guys to let's process through that a little bit.
So the cases that Teepa presented to us were all fairly unique and fairly different. Some involved multiple people, some involved established relationships, some involved nudity, some involved no nudity at all, but all related to the ideas of intimacy and sexuality. I'm curious for you, who do you think wrote those? Because oftentimes when we get some instances where we're told or there's been a report that someone's being sexually inappropriate and they happen to be living with dementia, the report's only written from one point of view. So Teepa did her best to write these reports from a view that is not her own, and oftentimes not taken into consideration the views of or the viewpoint of the person living with dementia in the scenario. So what we're going to start to consider now is, how do we start to pick apart this data? Because what we have here is lots of data, some of it assumptions by some people, but most of it an accurate representation in some cases of what the person has done historically or the type of dementia that the person has, which can all play a factor into these different scenarios. So we have a special tool in PAC, which is called the 6 pieces of the puzzle. And what Teepa is going to start to do shortly is actually dig into pieces of the puzzle. But before she does that, we're going to take a look at them ourselves. So here are the 6 pieces of the puzzle. We'll start with this blue box here in the middle, which is the person. Basically, historically, who has this person been? What have they done? That is often reported out, not by the person, but by other people, and can be collected in a wealth of different ways. Brain changes is the other box to consider here, which sometimes we have a specific diagnosis of a particular type of dementia, but it could be something else. We also want to take into consideration recent changes, maybe depression, anxiety, delirium. And then over here in this green box, health changes. How much nourishment and hydration is the person getting? Has there been a weight loss issue? Has there been a weight gain? Are there other medications to consider? But all of these collectively are basically the things that we get when we come into a scenario like this, whether we're involving sexuality or intimacy in the situation or not. Up top here, we have time, and we want to think about time of day, when things are happening, how people spend their time, stakeholders, who are the other people around in the scenario, and then certainly the environment, the consideration for, are things friendly, familiar, functional? What's the space look like? Is it sensation-wise a match for the person? Too hot, too cold, soft things, I like different patterns, those kinds of things. But these top 3 boxes are what we can start to consider as possible changes that may make a difference in a possibly uncomfortable situation, or at least a challenging one. So as we move forward, Teepa's going to be bringing up some of these ideas from 6 pieces of the puzzle. So think about for yourself, as you read a little bit of those cases, what was already in there and what might we have some more questions about? Because as we move back into the video recording, you're going to start to hear more about Sarah and her case. And we're going to do a bit of a deep dive with Sarah, but keeping in mind that these 6 pieces of the puzzle will help to guide what we do with Sarah and ultimately what Teepa figured out. Because Teepa did actually work with this woman and with the staff. So let's dig into it.
So let's look at, she's 79. She's widowed. She's retired school teacher. Any other information you want about her story, her backstory? Because I do have a little more data on her.
I'd want to know whether she had children. Well, you did say she's only has no immediate family, but in the past,
Right.
you have
No
children,
children.
widowed, no
She
children.
they never had children.
What age level did she teach?
She was elementary school. She taught 2nd and 3rd graders. She didn't like the 1st graders and the kindergartners. They couldn't use language quite well enough. She really liked 2nd and 3rd graders because they were so curious, and they would be willing to try just about everything. And she really enjoyed girls more than boys. The boys were always hard to get to pay attention. They had a hard time sitting still. So it wasn't that she didn't like them. She just liked little girls better because they love to learn. Little girls just love to learn. And they are so, I mean, they are curious about everything. The other thing to know, her husband had died actually 30 years ago. So she had been widowed a long time.
Had she had any close relationships, not necessarily intimate sexually, but other kinds of intimacy?
There were some other teachers from school who would come and spend time. There were a couple, but they always seemed sort of tearful, and they came solos. There weren't a lot of other visitors other than a couple teachers from school. That's all that people knew at the time. Other than that, nobody came to see her. She was in the same area where she had taught for years.
Was she an introvert, or is she an introvert or an extrovert?
She was a strong introvert, reported by everybody. She lived in the house alone for years. Other than doing school, she liked to hike. She liked to be outdoors. She liked to go do things. She also did a lot of handcrafts. And so the niece found all kinds of stuff. Like she was like a pack rat when the niece went in to do the house. She had crochet, she had knitting, she had sewing, but everything was all messed up. And she had actually had, I think a 30-pound weight loss before she ever even got admitted into the program. And this is the 3rd building she's been in. But they didn't identify what got her discharged from other locations. The niece did not reveal that until it was a one-on-one when the niece revealed that this behavior had resulted in her being kicked out of other facilities. Just so you know.
Oh, where does she think she is age-wise? Like, does she perceive herself as a young girl?
She doesn't have any language to really, if you watch her physical behaviors and what she does, she's so limited in what she can do. She doesn't have a lot of language. She can sing. She sings songs, a lot of them like kids songs or songs that you'd sing around kids, although she will sing Elvis and Beatles and things along that line. So she did do, who else did she do? She would do, wake up, little Susie, wake up. Who did that one? That was one of her favorites.
Everly Brothers.
The Everly Brothers. She really liked the Everly Brothers. So she would dance and have a great time when you did Everly Brothers. She also liked to have a wine glass, even though it was just apple juice or cranberry juice. She would always want to drink out of a wine glass. So they had a plastic wine glass.
Do we know anything about her early life? Like, obviously, if she has a niece, she had a sibling, I guess.
Yeah, she was the younger sister. The older sister and the niece were actually from 2 states over, and they didn't have that much contact. Holidays only, and Aunt Sarah would come for the holiday and bring like a dish for meals or something, but they didn't have a lot of contact with her until this came up.
Yeah, I'm wondering if they shared a room as children.
They did apparently, but the mom is dead, and so the niece doesn't know a lot, but they did share a room. Yeah, there was one room for the girls and one room for the boys. We did find that out.
Teepa, I'm curious about that last bullet point and the frequency of this. Is it every night? Is there some kind of established pattern? Is it randomized?
Apparently it is often in the nights when she gets up and tries to find the bathroom. And she could be led to the bathroom. She'll pee in the toilet if you direct her. So sometimes now she's waking up wet. But as soon as you get her in the bed, not long after that, staff were reporting that she was taking her nightgown off and leaving it off. And then so she would come out nude in the middle of the night and be looking for where to go. But it was often after they'd taken her to the bathroom and gotten her back in the nightgown and put her back in the bed. And then she would take the nightgown back off, and then she would come out and end up trying to go into other people's rooms and get in their beds. Anything else people want to think or talk about? So do you want to know how she approaches other people? Do you want to know what she does? Hey, baby. Hey, little girl. Give me a kiss. Will you give me a kiss? Come on. Come on. Come on, give me a kiss. Come on. Come on. Let's go. Let's go. Come on. Let's go. Let's go. And as she says, let's go, she's taking the hand and giving a little tug. Come on. Let's go. Let's go. And she likes to lead the other person around with her. Okay, anything else that you guys want to put out there? Okay. So what do we know about Sarah? That as we look at her various behaviors, I was asked to see her because there were members of the staff that were concerned about her sexual orientation and what she might do to other females that were on the unit, number one. I mean, so that was one of the reported reasons I was asked to come into this situation, because they were concerned about her sexual orientation and what she might try with other residents. Number two, there were other staff members that were concerned that her nudity in the hallways was not dignified. And when they would try to get her back in clothing, she would just take it right back off. But once she was awake at night, she would come out. She kept coming out of the room at night and she wouldn't have clothing on. And they would put it on and she would take it back off. There was a third group of folks that were particularly concerned about the kissing behavior, that she was approaching other residents and asking them for kisses. And that particularly was problematic for the evening staff when families were present, because she would do it when families were present, and she would approach family members as much as she would approach other residents with this kissing request and holding hands and trying to pull someone along. And so the staff that worked evenings were particularly concerned about her behavior. More in nights was concerned about the nudity, evenings was concerned about the kissing. There were just selected individuals that were concerned about sexual identity and what she could be doing or might try with other residents. And then the last concern was related to, they didn't think the niece was concerned enough about this behavior and needed to be more involved with her aunt if this was going to be cared for. And they were angry that the niece had not shared. So we had at least 2 staff members who were pretty angry the niece had not shared that this had been a previous behavior at other locations. So what are you thinking about your pieces of the puzzle? What are you thinking about the environment? What could be going on with the environment that Sarah is misinterpreting, or staff are misinterpreting, whichever way you want to take it? What do you think is going on environmentally that might help explain some of what we're seeing?
I would think, could it possibly be the temperature? Is she hot? Is that why she keeps taking her
Okay.
nightgown?
So environmentally, is the temperature in the space and the place too warm for what Sarah cares for? You know, she just doesn't like it that warm, and so she's coming out of clothing in order to chill herself down, to get cooled off.
The night, oops, sorry. The
Yeah,
night,
oh,
Go ahead, Gay, and then we'll catch Kathy in a second.
okay. I'm just thinking about my own patterns. I sleep in the nude, so I don't like having clothes on.
And that
Right.
was the question. That's a really good one, Jay. I was also,
Maybe more than people want to hear, but
I mean, well, I used to be a nude sleeper, but now I get cold at night, so it doesn't work for me anymore.
Right.
But yeah, we don't know whether her whole life has been a nude sleeper, because we don't have anybody to answer that question. So we don't know that her taking off clothing to go to bed isn't part of her natural tendency. I mean, it's just what she's always done. We don't know if it's a lifelong pattern or relatively new. We don't know if it's temperature controlled or it's just something she's always done. We don't know. And it's one we can't answer, but it doesn't seem to work to put the clothing back on.
and the texture of the clothing, you never know whether it's something that bothers her skin, what she's wearing.
There you go. So could it be either the texture of the clothing? They did say, well, this is her own nightgown. And I said, yeah, I got that. Doesn't seem to be one she's wearing. I wonder if it's one the niece bought her. Well, I don't know. I mean, and so there was a real frustration with, well, that's not my business, but she needs to keep it on. I don't care who bought it, kind of thing. So what else about the environment is really important that it's easy for us to forget about, because we work in these places.
Even the environment around, the amount of people could be cueing her to think that it's a classroom with
Either a classroom or a dormitory,
mm-hmm.
a house. What if it's a house? And I come out of my room and I'm looking for my room. Again, the idea of the hippocampus with wayfinding, what I'm looking for is the room I'm supposed to be in. But it's always, what gem state did we say? I said
Amber
that.
to Ruby.
Amber to Ruby. So Ambers to Ruby have what direction of travel in general? Forward. They go forward, and they go forward until there's a new forward, and then they go forward until there's a new forward. So once I come out, I'm going to be looking for where to go. Unfortunately, where I've been isn't going to occur to me. I'm just going somewhere. So, oh, there you go. There's my room. And so whatever's in front of me or whatever I find next, that becomes my room, because I can't go back. I don't have back. I don't have behind me. I don't have previous. I just have what's right in front of me. So what does coming out in the middle of the night also say about Sarah's desire to be alone?
Mm.
Is it lonely in that room all by herself? Where does she keep coming? And everybody keeps wanting her to go back in this lonely room. And what does Sarah keep doing?
She wants to crawl in bed with somebody.
She wants to be huddled up with somebody, apparently, because that's all she's looking for, is to get in bed with somebody so she can snuggle up and go to sleep.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder how long she had that in her life and how much maybe she's missed that in her life.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe nighttime might be the loneliest time. Why is night often a more difficult time to be alone than days?
Scary.
What's scary about night, Gay?
I think it's scary because there's things are looking different. Our perceptions are we can't really tell where we are. We don't have other people around. In the daytime, there's noises, there's things going on, but at night, and that's when all the squirrels start going in our heads anyway. I don't know like that, but if I wake up in the middle of the night and I can't get back to sleep, and it's like things going round, and I can't stop it.
So what also don't we know about this woman, because no one has lived intimately with her for a long time?
We don't know her sleep patterns.
We don't know her wake-sleep pattern. We don't know if she was a real early bird, has always been an early bird. We don't know if she was a midnight night owl, but figured out how to work in elementary school, even though she was a night owl. Nobody knows her intimately. So we don't have an intimate who can tell her story. So she's trying her best to tell us a story. And we're having a really hard time wanting to read that story, apparently. It's a tough story to read because what we see keeps interfering with our brain's ability to imagine what could she be looking for. I mean, what does she need? What does she want? Wonder what would happen if we draped her with a blanket or a lightweight something when she's out with us, rather than trying to make her go back to her room and put her PJs on, or her nightgown in this case. What would happen if you gave her clothing to wear rather than PJs to wear? So those are a couple of what ifs. What about the kissing behaviors?
Those didn't seem like, from your description and your visual, Teepa, very sexual kind of kisses. I mean, I'm thinking of like myself when I meet kind of a grandmother figure in my culture. It's very typical for me to do a kiss on the cheek and a kiss, hey, how's it going? So same with little kids potentially.
Yeah, so what did I do? Because this was exactly what Sarah would do. She would come forward and she'd go, give us a kiss, and then she would turn her cheek. So was it truly seeking intimacy, or was it trying to make
A relationship.
happen? So in this community, what are some questions you want to ask about people, staff particularly, around her? What are a couple questions my PAC team might want to ask about staff?
Are they younger?
They are. A lot of them were. Although she would approach just about any female. She never approached a male. Never. What else do you want to know about staff?
I would want to know if anybody has a special connection with her, that she feel comfortable with her when she's acting like that, or when she's asking for that kind of connection.
There were two people who didn't mind her.
Mm-hmm.
That's as close as I got. They didn't mind.
Is this a staff that was willing to consider the possibility of letting go of some of their preconceived notions or their feelings?
Okay, so that's a big question, Gay. I'm looking for a more concrete PAC question. That was good. It was all good. I'm looking for a PAC question.
I mean, I would ask how many staff are willing to touch and be touched by someone else, and who's willing to approach her. They don't have to like her, but can they stand touch? I mean, because if they can't do the kiss, can they at least get connected so that they can learn to use hand under hand to
Okay,
direct?
back up even further and ask if there's anybody on staff who is using
Hand in her hand.
PPA.
Yeah.
Yay.
Nobody, zero, nobody was trying to establish contact with her. Every interaction I watched was her seeking to find a connection with anybody. No one approached this woman. No one offered their hand to this woman. They would watch her coming and they would, no, Sarah, no. Because the most I found were 2 staff members who didn't mind her too much. And so what they would do as she came up was they'd kiss her cheek. But they would let her get right on top of them. No one used PPA. Zero. So what was her only contact with human beings?
Whatever she generated and personal care help.
Yep. How did they lead her around?
Yeah, probably not like she wanted.
Come on, Sarah. Come on, Sarah. Come on, honey. Come on, Sarah. Sarah, come with me. Come on. They would take her hand just like she took other people's hands, only she was nicer. He was more concerned about the other. And said, come on, come on, let's go. Let's go. And when you listen to staff, guess what they said? Come on, Sarah, let's go. Sarah, let's go. Come on, Sarah. Sarah, come on. And then they would get next to her ear. Sarah, I need you to come with me so I can help change you. Come on.
Whoa, that was a lot to unpack. You may not have been ready for it all. Maybe you hit pause while you're watching to take a look at your puzzle pieces again. But starting to recognize that we actually found out a bit, and people had some questions in the recorded webinar about the temperature and the feel of the gowns or the things that Sarah was wearing at night. Could that be a possible reason she was taking them off? The idea of, has Sarah historically been more of a night owl? Is she normally more active in the evening or at night than she was during the day and wanting to get with people and be with people at those times? And also starting to take into account what Teepa heard from stakeholders, what their beliefs were, what their perceptions were, and what they're willing to do and not do with Sarah. So there was one moment here where Teepa actually role played and basically demonstrated for us what it was like when Sarah approached people. And I'm wondering for you if that's the pictures you had in your head or if that was very different. Because having been on this webinar, that was very different than what I had perceived. But here's the piece of data you may have missed. Teepa actually also mentioned the gem state that Sarah was in most of the time. So now we're looking at a different tool, which is this gem state model. And for PAC as an organization and for Teepa, these gem states represent what other folks would call this journey of dementia, sometimes calling it stages. We think of them as states because they're fluid. We don't believe that people are in the same place all the time, every hour of the day. So what Teepa mentioned was Sarah was in more of an amber to ruby state from what she could observe and watching her interact with people and staff. So the ideas of ambers and rubies here in these 2 gem states, not strong language use. So a few words at a time, maybe some familiar phrases coming out, still able to move, but move with more of a gross motor skill. So the idea of using a whole hand and pulling someone makes a lot of sense in the description and the way that Teepa demonstrated. And also what we know about folks in more of an amber state is sensory need or intolerance can be a big driving force in what they do. So the idea that, maybe this lack of sensory input, this lack of touch and physical intimacy, but not sexual intimacy, could be driving Sarah's idea of approaching people or wanting to be connected. Or it could be some of the reason that she is actually removing her clothing at night if it's uncomfortable, if it's too hot, if it's just itchy. Or it could be that someone, as someone brought up in the recorded webinar, is this just a past history kind of pattern? Is this just the way she's always slept? And when she gets in, it's a familiar habit that still kicks in. Because even late into the disease, people still hold on to their preferences. The only difference is my prefrontal cortex may not be working the same way it was before. So if I was going to sleep nude, I may not be as worried about getting up and interacting with people. So figuring out for you if that's where you thought we would end up or not, but starting to recognize that this challenging situation, we started to pull it apart by thinking about the 6 pieces of the puzzle along with the gem state that Sarah was showing us. So giving some consideration to not only looking at a report, but also getting to view things with your own eyes or with an unbiased eye of maybe a recording that's available or that people can share with you if you can't come in. Because the perception is often different from what's happening or what's possible. So we're going to do a little more work with the scenario, and Teepa's going to guide us through a bit of a wrap up, but we'll get to hear from more folks in the group about what they were thinking. So we'll dig back in.
Now that we've done all this, what are 3 possible explanations for some of Sarah, and how can we help people see her differently? What are a couple of ideas? So what are 3 explanations, 3 very different explanations for Sarah? What do you think?
Sarah is very lonely.
So Sarah's not sexual at all. She's not inappropriate at all. She's just really lonely and trying to make connections with other human beings. And she maybe comes from a culture where kissing on the cheek is perfectly acceptable way to do it, and leading people around. She spent most of her life leading people around, and so she's just leading people around or being led, as the case may be. What else?
I must admit, my first, when you read through it, was, we've got a lesbian woman who's lived a closet life.
It is very possible for somebody of Sarah's vintage and age that her husband and she had a marriage that either they discovered during their marriage that really she was lesbian or she's bisexual. But after she lost that relationship, she had maybe other relationships. We don't know. I mean, we know she has no children. We know no people know much about her. We had a couple visits, but those women didn't come when I was there, so I don't know anything about their level of intimacy with her. I don't know if they were work colleagues or something more for her. It was clear she didn't have a partner, somebody who would be partnered with her, who stepped forward at all. The niece was the only person they could find to take healthcare power of attorney.
I'll follow up my comment with, after the further descriptions and more information about her, that went out the window.
Yeah. I mean, if it is or if it isn't, I'm not sure she's sexually active as a lesbian. It doesn't appear that whether she's straight or whether she's gay, she's actually looking for sexual intimacy. It looks like she's looking for comfort and connection a lot. And so the question becomes, how do we deliver the goods? How do we deliver friendship? How do we deliver a sense of acceptance of her when the big challenge is the vast majority, except for 2 people in the staff, didn't mind her. Everybody had decided something about Sarah. How do we help them move away from the decision they've made and the belief that they have? How do we do that? What are some ideas you have about doing that? And I'm going to remind people to go from unaware to aware to knowledgeable to skilled. We want to think about experiences we can have people have, so that as they have experiences and they learn from those experiences, they can change how they think and feel and act because of the experiences they have and processing those experiences with them. What do you think?
Well, I wonder if she is mirroring what she sees the others do. So when she sees the staff members go and put their hand out and they're getting touched, and when they're whispering in their ear, she could assume that they're kissing the lips. That's what she is perceiving they're doing. So if you can do a tactile, like maybe hand massages or something, so that.
Okay, so Kathy, pause, because I love your idea. It's a great idea. So how can we help staff see themselves the way Sarah sees them? What could we do with permission?
I'm wondering about maybe a recording of some kind to see what happens when I allow Sarah to just give me a peck on the cheek and then she kind of wanders off, or just I got what I needed and now I'm bye, I'm done with you, versus I don't do it, and is there a different outcome potentially?
Okay, so Alejandro's proposing sort of a if I do, if I don't, just a one-on-one with Sarah where we're demonstrating what happens if we do. And Kathy is proposing what would happen, wonder whether or not there's mirroring going on. And so for Kathy's, I was wondering about the possibility of videotaping the area and how staff are behaving and have them look at themselves and then look at Sarah's behavior and see if they see similarities. With Alejandro's, we could videotape some interactions of responding, not responding, and see what Sarah does in those two different situations. Anything else folks could think of as a starter point to help staff get to a different place of viewing and perceiving Sarah as they do versus how we're able to take a look at Sarah?
It'd be also interesting to just get their ideas of what kissing entails and what's a sexual, like a visual of a more sexual kissing and then a friendly relationship. I just want to hang out with you, kind of a kiss or hug.
Well, I wonder whether even viewing greeting behaviors in different cultures might be helpful for them to just see different cultural behaviors around how do we greet one another in different cultures. What about, wonder whether it would be, if we could video some, what would she do with hand under hand? What happens if as she moves toward us, instead of reacting, we responded with hand under hand and became responsive? And we gave them a new tool that they could respond when Sarah's out, and wonder about if we said, how about if we try a couple of different things at night when she comes out? Rather than have her go back, what if we have her come out with us and spend time with us and just wrap her, or else give her some clothing and let's see, put on her regular clothes at night, see how long she'll stay up.
Teepa, you also asked how would we work with staff to get them, and I like all these ideas. I wonder if in just having a conversation with staff about their attitudes and what they're thinking is going on, why, not pointing any fingers or anything like that, but just having this kind of discussion with them. And also, I know how impactful it was just to have you demonstrate and have us experience the difference between hand under hand and how it makes you feel when you're being clothed or unclothed, and just having them experience that.
Okay, so
telling them about it.
When I gave you the hard data on the PowerPoint, it was easy to have an opinion about that. And then as we talked through and we started processing through, what could that be? How could that be? Helping people look on the other side of a situation so that they start to see another perspective, another point of view. What's another possible explanation for that? I wonder if that in and of itself changes people's perceptions, it turns out, when we get into the idea of intimacy and sexuality. And yet this very conversation makes people so uncomfortable. And until we get past the initial conversation that this is what's happening, but we want to take a step back and learn more about the human being, other things about her body, like for Carolyn, does she get hot at night? And then her dementia, where is she in her dementia? Is she really going to be able to have the fine motor skill to have a high intensity intimate relationship? I mean, she can take her gown off and on because it's pretty straight up and down. It's a loose gown. What would happen if it was fitted? I don't know, because she didn't have any of those gowns. They had asked the niece to get really easy to get in and out of clothing because that's just what we do. And so it's real easy for Sarah to come in and out of her clothes. So, you know, is that what we want, or who knows? Then looking at staff and what their beliefs and their frustrations were, helping them really look at that and not pushing buttons, but saying, it sounds like you're concerned about X, Y, or Z. and looking at the environment and what we're doing with the environment and where Sarah is with time use. What's happening for Sarah all day long? What happens to Ruby's all day long? What did I say some of her gifts were? She's really good with singing and she really likes people and she'll dance, so she can dance. And so where can people get some intimacy needs met that's really acceptable in our culture? Because people don't think about dancing. Remember how I started with the football game and, you know, going to the hot dogs? I mean, if we create spaces and places where activities encourage one to have physical intimacy without it being sex, could it help meet everybody's comfort level? Because when we're dancing and they're dancing, people just don't think about how close your body is and holding hands and moving around. And it's just a different awareness, I guess is the word I would use.
So were you kind of in line with some of the explanations that our group gave and that Teepa gave? Because the group brought up that the things that Sarah's doing from our scenario could just be because she's lonely. She actually is lacking physical intimacy. Or maybe she's lost in time and space. Maybe she isn't fully recognizing that it's not okay for me to walk outside of my room. But also starting to recognize that we have some other components here. We have a staff who is looking for something different to try because what they've been trying has not worked. It has not given them the results that were intended or wanted. So starting to consider also, well, if we think that Sarah does have a need for physical contact or some, maybe even emotional intimacy, how can we give that in a way that's appropriate? So one of the considerations Teepa gave was, well, if she likes to sing and dance, could that be a way that it's okay for her to be intimate and people actually expect her to touch other people if they're going to dance or sing and hold hands? So starting to think back to this idea of care planning and starting to give consideration to how do you fill up your bucket for intimacy and how would you want others to help you do that? Because what we can do to help Sarah at this moment is manipulate some of the pieces of the puzzle, manipulate the skills of the stakeholders, manipulate the time that we give to Sarah and how we spend time with Sarah. But we can't necessarily get her to see our perspective on things. Her brain's working differently than ours is at this point. So Teepa also brings in this question of how do we start to get staff who are going to be working with Sarah to view this thing a little bit differently? And she brings in the idea of moving through basically a step ladder approach of going from being unaware, and I truly don't know some of the things about Sarah, to awareness and, oh, well, that's interesting. Maybe she slept in the nude the whole time. Maybe she's actually reaching out to us a whole bunch and trying to kiss because she doesn't get that physical touch anywhere else. Maybe that's just the way she greeted people historically. And then moving to knowledge. Oh, so you're telling me that this brain is changing, and then I can't expect her to see my side of the street. And then moving to skill, which is actually starting to manipulate some of the puzzle pieces, or as Teepa mentioned, using positive physical approach and touch that we're okay with to fill up this bucket of intimacy. And then ultimately becoming competent. The idea that all these things are going to be rolled into one with support. Because Teepa being called into the scenario doesn't mean that Teepa gets to continue with the scenario or come back frequently. Oftentimes it's the care partners who are there that need to try something different. So thinking about who you work with, if you have a partner, if you have staff you're working with, how do you move them through this progression of being unaware to aware? And someone brought in this idea of a huddle, an idea of let's talk this through, let's look at the pieces together. Because as a team is a different feel than me going in and telling you what you should do or what you should know. That's what they're already trying with Sarah. and it's not working. So we're going to dig into the last piece of the video, which is our wrap up. But starting to think about for you, what are some of your takeaways? Because we're going to hear from the group, and also Teepa's going to throw in some more things for us to consider.
I'm curious as to what people are thinking compared to what you thought coming into this situation. Because what I'm using and what will be in the PowerPoint is the strategy of the 6 pieces of the puzzle that we use every time, and the gathering of more data and the appreciation of each person's perspective. What are you thinking right now about this session and about what it's doing for you as far as what skills or knowledge or awareness you're developing for this idea of intimacy and sexuality?
It helped you realize that it's not just black and white. It's not sexual versus non-sexual. There's all sorts of relationships, and we have a tendency to jump to the conclusion that it's always sexual.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like that, Kathy. Yeah, it's really easy to jump to a conclusion rather than take a step back and say, what about this as being human? And in our humanness, you know, I have needs and I have likes and I have wants and I have dislikes and I have don't wants. And because we can't pre-plan dementia and because we aren't comfortable talking about this stuff, it goes unsaid until we're in the middle of it. So it turns out the words that get used and how they're interpreted by the other person, if we don't do that thing that we do in PACT called checking in and reflecting, so that what I heard you saying and what I think you were asking is this. So the person can go, oh no, that wasn't what I was talking about at all. I mean, I don't want to stick it anywhere. I just want to be able to lay next to her and not pee on her. That's all. I mean, you know, that idea of what am I asking for? And people making assumptions from wherever you're headed from, whatever it is, whether it's, you know, a urinate, whatever. But the idea is not checking out the message very clearly. We can get off on a really different track. And I had one a little different where a woman was asking the physician for her and she was the healthcare power of attorney for her husband. I need something for his sex drive. I really need something for his sex drive. And so the doctor, not asking further information, put him on Viagra. And this was back when Viagra first came out. So people didn't know what the little blue pills were. And so the wife was giving him the pills and said, it's worse than ever. Oh my God. I mean, this is outrageous. He's having hard-ons all the time. I thought you were going to give him something. And he said, well, I did. And it was just, talk about your miscommunication. What the physician didn't understand is the husband already had a lot of sex drive and she was asking him to dial it back and dial it down. It was a younger wife with an older husband. And because dementia was involved, the physician didn't even consider the possibility that what was being sought was a lessening of sexual intimacy, not an intensification of sexual intimacy. So an assumption, not an assessment. And unfortunately, when it comes to sexuality and intimacy, there's way more assumptions there than there are assessments of situations. So good. Anybody else taking away something from this session that you feel like will help you in the work that you're doing or helps you in the life that you're living?
Yes, definitely for me. I see it as being a wonderful, what do they call it, gold mine. Not just for that particular topic, but there's all kinds of things that we've talked about around this one little issue. I mean, this one seeming a little issue, all kinds of things come out of it. And so it's well worth moving past whatever block we might have.
Good.
To talking about
Super.
and
Because,
dealing with it.
I mean, let me just, the thing I didn't tell you about, Sarah, is people who had tried sleeping medications, they had tried anti-anxiety medications. They were actually considering antipsychotic medications because they were so distressed about her behavior. But in their mind, her behavior was escalating. And when I watched the behavior, there wasn't an escalation. There was a dislike of Sarah. which meant rather than being annoyed and irritated, they felt her behavior was risky. She wasn't doing anything that really, I mean, you could actually guide her out of anybody's room. I mean, she was just looking for a place to be with somebody, but you could get her to come back out with just nothing but putting your hand out and say, come on, Sarah, come with me. And she would come. So the idea that people were literally had already tried and were additionally considering additional medication to manage her, it's a little frightening to me. And unfortunately, in many cases, these things happen because people don't know what to do and they don't have the ability to think things through, in my experience. So, all right. So, yeah. So, we actually did do, in one of the other sexual intimacies, I actually went into the situation where we were talking about the situation where the gentleman early in Alzheimer's was very interested in having sex, and his wife became tearful and fearful, but got real quiet when they went in the room together and did not appear to continue that sort of behavior of distress. And that was one where we have two different people, both who are living with dementia. One who's early on, who can still identify his wife as his wife and his needs as his preferences, and feels he is, and he was actually at that time the only person identified as her healthcare power of attorney, which is a whole nother, that's a whole nother universe where when we only select one person and that person also as a spouse or a significant other develops a dementia themselves and there is no one else identified, now the decision maker is impaired and is supposed to be making decisions for another and they themselves are impaired. How do we deal with that? And what that results in a legal mess. Because we do not have, at that point, they were actually seeking a guardian ad litem for the wife, and we're going to take the husband. I got involved when they were going to take the husband to court because there were people concerned in the facility about his behavior in a sense that he was aggressing against her and possibly abusing her. And so they had petitioned to have a guardian ad litem for her because they felt that he could not represent her. And so now we're going to go to court with this situation. And all too often in our society, we don't know how to deal with these issues, and we don't have strategies to deal with these issues, and we don't form, guess what people didn't, guess how many people did not like the husband? All the staff. All staff did not like or trust the husband. And yet there was no evidence over the long, I mean, they'd been married for 60 years. There was absolutely no evidence. There were lots of loving pictures. They were a partnership. They worked together. They lived together. They ran a business together. There were no children. They were solo. And all the money they had, they invested in the retirement community, into the care. They had some friends, but most of their friends had died. They were both in their 80s and they weren't coming to visit very much. Some of the people from church said that they were an ideal couple. They didn't know much about them. So here's a situation where, again, black sheep, white sheep, all or nothing. And what we know legally, it's a mess. I mean, it's truly a huge mess. If facilities err on one side or the other, they end up on the front page of newspapers. We have some ombudsmen who are volunteers and frequently may or may not have a lot of knowledge about various forms and types and progression of dementia, but also may have belief sets about what's okay and what's not okay. And that's how this one sort of escalated. Then we have state surveyors, and we have, it's just truly, we are on the very front edge of raising questions rather than having answers. So Christine, although I'd love to be able to say, well, this is what you do, and there is a procedure and it's really clear, and this is, if you do this, then everything will work out. What I can tell you is right now across this nation, across actually the world, there aren't clear guidelines and boundaries. People don't have a clear picture. If I know I like you with the hat, And I know I want to spend time with you. And I actually want to hold your hand and I want to kiss and I want to cuddle with you. Although I don't know your name. And I call you by my husband's name. But I know what I like. And I know what I like is touching you and being next to you. What happens in that situation will basically vary times 1,000, depending on who are the other people in the mix and where the location is, where it's happening. And what about the family of the gentleman in the hat? And what about the other residents? And what about the surveyors? And what about, we will have 1,000 different outcomes, but rarely will my needs get met. Because people don't look at me, the person living with dementia, as having an opinion in that moment of value. Frequently, people want to go back to what I said I would do when I could say what I would do. But now that I'm here and I'm doing what I'm doing, people are having a hard time interpreting that and having that there's value in what I'm doing in that moment. And it may not be the same thing I thought it was going to be, but in that moment, it seems pretty valuable to me. And I am demonstrating my likes or my dislikes, but it's not consistent with my values, particularly if my husband is still alive. And when he comes, I'm not interested in him because he looks old. And I'm not interested in an old guy. I'm interested in my husband, this guy right here, the young one. And so that whole, what's going to happen to me is not based on science or art. It's simply based on circumstances and the roll of the dice right now. And our goal is to try to get this to start to make a little more sense for the person living with dementia and the people living around by coming to a place of appreciation and understanding and building knowledge and awareness and skill. But right now, every case will turn out the way it turns out because of who has power, who has control, and who does something and who does not. And all too often, it doesn't result in a good outcome, what I would call a good outcome or even an adequate outcome for the person living with dementia and the people who care. There's a lot of pain and there's a lot of labeling. And unfortunately, there's very little good care. Not because people don't want to, but because they're having a hard time figuring out how to do this thing and how to accept what is and how to work within it and realize in very, very few situations am I actually trying to have sexual intercourse with you. In all too many situations, I'm trying to find a level of intimacy that matches my previous abilities without those abilities. So how do I find a friend? How do I find somebody to be with when nobody wants me? So to make life better, we did this webinar. Because at least now we've got a few more people out there who are curious and want to ask questions rather than make judgments. So thank you all for coming. And if there's a way or a time in which you can use some of this information, then I think we did a good thing.
So you've spent some time digging into a scenario that we thought was going to be really about sexuality, but was likely more about intimacy. How are you feeling after discussing and thinking about this idea of intimacy and sexuality and dementia? What's your takeaway? What are you now going to give consideration to when you start to get some reports, when you start to hear phrases like sexually inappropriate? Can you stay curious? Can you dig into some puzzle pieces? Curiosity killed the cat. But if we can stay curious, it's actually going to do the opposite for our relationships with people, with staff, and with people living with dementia. Because we can't put away this idea of intimacy and sexuality. We want to talk about it. We want to bring it out. And hopefully you've got something to go back to. Ooh. And if you want to go back and revisit, go back to the parts where there were other scenarios, because we only got to dig into one. See what different lens you might have given those different scenarios. More intimacy issues, more sexuality issues. What new things would you be willing to try given those scenarios? And how are you going to start some planning for you or for someone else around this area that is sometimes well overlooked. Thank you for not overlooking it. And we appreciate you digging in and becoming aware or knowledgeable or maybe even skillful in some of this stuff. So take care, be well. We'll see you next time.